If you stood long enough on the corner of Clark Street and Foster Avenue in Chicago, long enough for the seasons to bleed into one another, you would notice two things remain constant. The first was the screech of the number 22 bus grinding to a halt every 15 minutes, exhaling its hydraulic breath onto the wet pavement. The second was the dog. He wasn't a particular breed you could name, a scruffy terrier mix with eyes the color of old pennies and fur the texture of steel wool. He didn't belong to the street, not really. He wasn't stray, he was just waiting. Rain, snow, or blistering heat, he sat there. He didn't beg for scraps from the commuters rushing toward the L train. He didn't chase squirrels up the mighty oak trees lining the avenue. He just watched the folding doors of that bus. Every time they hissed open, his ears would twitch, his tail would give a hopeful thump against the concrete, and his whole body would tense with expectation. And every time the doors closed without him stepping off, the dog would let out a soft sigh that seemed too heavy for his small chest, settle back onto his haunches, and reset his gaze for the next 15 minutes. Most people just hurried past, their eyes glued to their phones, oblivious to the silent vigil taking place in their periphery. But some noticed. The bodega owner on the corner noticed. The regular 8:15 a.m. commuters noticed. They saw the seasons change in the graying of the dog's muzzle, but the unwavering devotion in his eyes never aged a day. They didn't know his story yet, but they knew they were witnessing something that defied the hurried pace of the modern world. That corner of Andersonville became defined by his presence. The neighborhood, a tight-knit mix of old brick two-flats and trendy new cafes, eventually adopted him without anyone ever truly taking him home. They named him Rusty, for the reddish hue his coat took on when wet with the autumn rain. Mrs. Higgins, who had run the flower shop across the street for 30 years, was the first to intervene. She started leaving a heavy ceramic bowl of fresh water and a tattered, moth-eaten wool blanket under the relative dryness of the bus shelter's awning. The morning commuters followed suit, dropping pieces of sausage from their breakfast sandwiches or high-end dog treats bought specifically for him. Rusty accepted these offerings with a gentle, polite nuzzle, but his focus never truly wavered from the asphalt lane where the number 22 rolled in. He was a fixture, as permanent as the cracked sidewalk or the flickering lamppost that buzzed overhead. But unlike those inanimate objects, Rusty carried a palpable aura of heavy, quiet sadness that seemed to dampen the air around him, even on sunny days. He was a living monument to an unfinished story. Newcomers to the area would stop, confused by the sight of a dog alone at a bus stop, and ask, "Whose dog is that? Is he lost?" The neighborhood veterans would just shake their heads, looking away to hide the sudden moisture in their eyes. "He's not lost," they'd say, their voices thick. "He knows exactly where he is. He's just waiting. He's been waiting for 7 years." The winters were the hardest to watch. When the wind whipped off Lake Michigan and barreled down the avenues, turning the city into an icebox, the neighborhood's worry for Rusty reached a fever pitch. On those mornings, when the slush on the sidewalk froze into jagged peaks, Mrs. Higgins would arrive at her shop an hour early just to check on him. She'd find him curled into a tight, shivering ball beneath the wool blanket, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He would be coated in a thin layer of frost, looking less like a dog and more like a discarded statue. Yet if anyone tried to coerce him into the warmth of a car or a nearby entryway, Rusty would dig in his claws. He wouldn't growl or snap. He would simply lower his center of gravity, an immovable 60 pounds of stubborn devotion. His eyes would widen with frantic panic, fixed on the bus stop sign as if moving even 5 feet away might cause him to miss the most important moment of his life. Officer Davies, a beat cop who had patrolled Andersonville long enough to see the neighborhood gentrify 3 times over, remembered the early days. "It was a Tuesday back in 17, Davies recalled one afternoon, warming his hands around a coffee cup in Mrs. Higgins's shop, watching Rusty through the rain-streaked window. "I thought he'd just gotten loose. No collar, no chip when we scanned him later. We chalked it up to another abandonment. Sad, but common. Animal control had come out that first week. That was the only time anyone ever heard Rusty make a sound, other than that heavy sigh. As the catchpole looped around his neck, he let out a howl, a guttural, terrified sound of pure desolation that stopped traffic on Clark Street. It wasn't aggression, it was heartbreak given voice. The animal control officer, a hardened veteran named Maria, had stopped cold. She looked at the dog's terrified eyes, then at the bus stop and slowly lowered the pole. "He's waiting for someone," she had said softly. "Taking him away now. It would break whatever spirit he has left." They made a pact then, the neighborhood and the city workers. As long as he was healthy, as long as he wasn't a danger, Clark and Foster was his home. He was an exception to the leash laws, a grandfathered-in resident of the bus stop. Over the years, people tried to solve the mystery. They scrolled through thousands of ancient lost dog posts on Craigslist and Facebook, dating back to that year. None matched the scruffy terrier mix with the intense amber eyes. He was a ghost waiting for a ghost. As the years piled up, Rusty's muzzle turned stark white. His movements grew stiffer, his rise to greet the bus slower. Arthritis was settling into his hips, a cruel tax for sleeping on concrete for 2,500 nights. But the ritual never changed. The 5:45 p.m. bus was always the hardest to watch. It was the peak commuter drop-off. Dozens of weary people would spill out, eager to get home. Rusty would stand, his tail wagging with furious, desperate energy, scanning every knee, smelling every pant leg. And then the crowd would disperse. The bus would pull away with a diesel roar, and Rusty would be left alone on the wet pavement, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving him looking smaller and older than before. He would turn in 3 tight circles and lie back down on his blanket, his eyes already fixing on the horizon for the next set of headlights. The truth didn't arrive with a bang, but on a quiet, drizzly Tuesday in late October. The leaves on Clark Street had turned a bruised purple and gold, slicking the sidewalks around Rusty's vigil site. A woman stepped off the 2:30 p.m. bus. She looked to be in her late 40s, clutching a worn leather portfolio, looking lost. She wasn't a regular commuter. She held her phone out, following GPS directions. She took 3 steps, then froze. She dropped her portfolio. It hit a puddle with a wet slap. Rusty, dozing under his blanket, jerked his head up at the sound. He looked at the woman, his ears twitching uncertainly. He didn't know her, yet something about her posture, the sheer shock on her face, held his attention. Mrs. Higgins was arranging an autumn wreath in her shop window when she saw the woman slowly sink to her knees right there on the wet pavement, heedless of the mud staining her trousers. Mrs. Higgins hurried out, an umbrella in hand. "Are you all right, dear?" The woman was trembling, one hand covering her mouth, her eyes locked on the greying dog. "Buster?" she whispered, her voice cracking. At the sound of that name, a name hadn't heard in 2,500 days, Rusty let out a sharp bark. He stood up, his arthritic back legs shaking, and took a hesitant step toward the stranger. "Oh my God," the woman sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. "We thought he ran off to die in the woods. We thought coyotes got him." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the woman's raw emotion. Mrs. Higgins gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know this dog?" The woman wiped her eyes, looking up at the florist. "His name isn't Rusty. It's Buster. He belonged to my Uncle Arthur. Arthur Abernathy." The name rang a bell for Officer Davies, who had just pulled up in his patrol car. "Old Art. Lived in the grey bungalow on Ashland. Quiet guy, always wore that tweed cap." "That's him," the woman nodded, reaching out a trembling hand. Rusty, Buster, inched forward and tentatively licked her fingers. The scent was familiar. It smelled like family. Arthur was a creature of habit, she explained, her voice hollow. Every morning at 8:15, Buster walked him here. Arthur would take the number 22 down to the VA hospital for his treatments. And every evening at 5:45 sharp, Arthur would step off that bus, give Buster a piece of beef jerky, and they'd walk home together. The crowd went silent. The realization began to settle over them like a heavy fog. 7 years ago last week, the woman continued, stroking the dog's wet head. Uncle Arthur didn't come home. We got the call around 7 p.m. He'd had a massive heart attack on the bus right around Diversey Avenue on the return trip. He died before the ambulance reached the hospital. She looked at the bus shelter, then back at the dog. When we went to his house the next day to handle arrangements, Buster was gone. We searched for weeks. We never dreamed he just came here and waited. Rusty didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He leaned his heavy head against the woman's knee, letting out that same long sigh. He was waiting for a man who had died on the very vehicle he watched every day. Listen, I know how these videos usually go. This is the part where I'm supposed to loudly tell you to smash that like button and hit the bell. But honestly, after learning about Buster's loyalty, that feels kind of cheap. We are trying to build something different here. A corner of the internet that isn't afraid to feel things deeply, to recognize that the connection we have with animals is sometimes the purest thing in our lives. If this story made your chest tighten a little, if it made you look at your own dog and just want to hug them tighter, then you belong here with us. If you want to stick around for more stories that matter, I'd be genuinely honored if you subscribed. No pressure. And please, down in the comments, I don't want generic stuff today. If you have a creature in your life who loves you with even a fraction of Buster's devotion, just tell me their name below. Let's fill this comment section with the names of the good boys and girls who make our lives better. The story of the Hachiko of Chicago didn't stay on that street corner for long. Within 48 hours of Sarah's arrival, the news had rippled through the city. Local news vans from WGN and CBS parked along Clark Street, their satellite dishes pointing toward the grey sky, as reporters spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the dog who refused to believe in death. Sarah had tried, with all the gentleness in her heart, to bring Buster home to her farm in Naperville. She brought his old leash, the one Arthur used to hold, and a bag of his favorite treats. But as she tried to lead him toward her SUV, Buster's reaction broke the hearts of everyone watching on the sidewalk. He didn't growl, he simply sat. He leaned his weight back, his eyes darting frantically toward the approaching number 22 bus. He let out a low, mournful whimper that seemed to say, "If I leave now, and he finally steps off, he'll be all alone." Sarah knelt in the oil-stained slush and sobbed into his fur. She realized then what the neighborhood had known for years. Buster wasn't just a dog waiting. He was the keeper of a sacred promise. To take him away was to strip him of his purpose. "He stays," Sarah announced, wiping her eyes as she stood up. "If this is where he needs to be to feel close to my uncle, then this is where he will be. But he won't be sleeping on a wet blanket anymore." The response from the city was nothing short of a miracle. A local carpenter, moved by the evening news, arrived with a custom-built insulated doghouse. It was painted to match the grey bungalow where Arthur had once lived, complete with a tiny shingled roof and a heated floor mat donated by the hardware store 3 blocks down. The Chicago Transit Authority, CTA, did something unprecedented. They issued an official memo to all drivers on the number 22 route. They were instructed to give a short, soft toot of the horn as they approached Clark and Foster, a salute to the neighborhood's most loyal commuter. Some drivers even began carrying treats in their pockets, tossing one out the door every time they stopped, a tribute to the man who never made it home. People started coming from all over Illinois. They didn't come to take photos or pet him, most stood back, giving him the space his dignity deserved. They brought flowers, piling them against the brick wall behind the bus stop, until the corner smelled like a spring garden in the middle of a Chicago autumn. They brought letters, tucked into the gaps of the bricks, addressed to Arthur, telling him what a good boy he had left behind. Buster became more than a dog, he became a mirror. In his unwavering eyes, the stressed office workers saw a loyalty they craved in their own lives. The lonely saw a companion who understood the weight of silence. The grieving saw a reflection of their own refusal to let go. But as the weeks passed, it was clear that the 7 years of concrete and cold had taken their toll. Buster spent more time inside his heated house, only dragging himself out when he heard the specific hydraulic hiss of the number 22. His tail didn't wag as hard anymore, but his eyes, those amber, soulful eyes, never lost their focus. He was tired. His bones ached with the weight of nearly 3,000 missed bus arrivals, but his heart was still anchored to that curb. He was waiting for one specific pair of shoes to hit the pavement, and he wasn't going anywhere until he found them. On a quiet Tuesday in February, exactly 7 years and 4 months since the vigil began, the heavy snow finally stopped falling over Andersonville. The air was unnervingly still. When the 5:45 p.m. bus pulled up to Clark and Foster, the driver waited a few extra seconds, his hand hovering over a small bag of treats. But for the first time in years, there was no scruffy head poking out from the grey doghouse. There was no hopeful thump of a tail, Mrs. Higgins was the one who found him. He looked as though he were merely dreaming, curled tightly on his heated mat, his chin resting on one of Arthur's old tweed caps that Sarah had brought him. He had passed away in his sleep, his heart finally giving out under the weight of so much waiting. The news hit Chicago like a physical blow. That evening, the number 22 bus didn't just toot its horn. Every driver who passed the corner slowed to a crawl and removed their hats. By midnight, the bus shelter was buried under a mountain of flowers, dog toys, and thousands of candles that flickered against the Chicago wind. Today, if you visit that corner, you won't see a scruffy dog, but you will see a small bronze plaque embedded in the concrete of the sidewalk. It doesn't list dates of birth or death. It simply reads, "Buster. He waited for a friend who never came and taught a city how to love." People say that on foggy nights when the number 22 pulls up and the doors hiss open, you can almost hear the faint, joyful bark of a dog who has finally seen a familiar face step off the bus. Buster isn't waiting anymore. The vigil is over. The promise is kept, and somewhere, in a place where the buses are never late and the sun always shines, an old man in a tweed cap is finally reaching into his pocket for a piece of beef jerky, saying, "Good boy, Buster. I'm home."